When I was an undergraduate at CUNY almost 10 years ago, I was studying water and sanitation issues in developing countries. By my senior year, I was focused on the unsexiest topic, where people poop. I would travel to water and sanitation conferences in Stockholm and Montreal and speak with the world's foremost leaders on the subject about how unsexy but necessary addressing water and sanitation issues were to public health and to disrupt cycles of poverty. Fast forward to 2016, and I am now studying or focusing on arguably the world's sexiest topic, diversity and inclusion. Before I define what I mean by diversity and inclusion and the work that I do, I want to go back and explain what I mean by sexy topic. A sexy topic has nothing to do with sex, but it is a topic that is buzzworthy. Virtually everyone, everywhere, is talking about it. It's probably a trending hashtag, and because it's so buzzworthy, it can be talked about one moment and forgotten the next. The CUNY Cultural Corps is a workforce initiative that was developed after a study came out talking about the lack of diversity in cultural institutions in New York City. And spoiler alert, this is not just an NYC problem. And with the Cultural Corps, I'm going to talk about how we can move past it being a sexy of the moment topic to talking about how we sustain its impact. But first, let's define diversity and inclusion. Diversity is simply acknowledging the differences that we all have, which can be represented here by the different characteristics on this chart, and making sure that these different groups of people are represented. Inclusion, we're talking about creating environments where people feel supported and respected and are encouraged to participate and contribute to whatever issues there may be. And with diversity and inclusion, although we're not just talking about race and ethnicity, some of the most glaring statistics that we have about diversity have to do with race and ethnicity. If we look at NYC cultural institutions, we can see that over 62% of cultural sector workers are white non-Hispanic, despite the fact that 33% of New Yorkers are identified as white non-Hispanic. Furthermore, if we look at the types of jobs that people are doing with the breakdown in race, we can see that more than 70% of minorities are working in security and facilities. And while those are important jobs, they also tend to be lower wage, and they are not the positions that are influencing what we're seeing in these institutions. But let's look nationally. Over 60%, or 70% are white non-Hispanic in the US. And despite the fact that, yes, there are 62% of white non-Hispanic individuals in the US total population, let's look again at the types of jobs people are doing. Over 50% of minorities, again, are working in security and facilities issues, and less than 30% are working in leadership positions. And for the Department of Cultural Affairs in NYC, the CUNY Cultural Corps was looked at as a solution to address the lack of diversity by creating a pipeline program into New York City cultural institutions. So how did I get here? How did I go from studying water and sanitation issues to now focusing on diversity and inclusion in New York City cultural institutions? Well, the truth is, I have always been interested in culture. And I grew up in a multicultural household where I was exposed to music and the arts. And it was also the fact that my mom is a New Yorker, And I was enamored with New York and wanted to be where all of the culture was happening. And so when I enrolled as an undergraduate at the City University of New York, I was really excited to jump into all the culture that New York had to offer. And fortunately, was able to do that with a freshman seminar called The Arts in New York City. In preparation for this talk, I went through my college documents and found a cultural notebook that we were required to keep for class. In it, I talked about my visit to the Studio Museum in Harlem, a leading museum of African American art in the United States. That day, I saw an exhibit by Barclay L. Hendricks called The Birth of the Cool, and in it was a portrait of Fela Kuti, a Nigerian Afrobeat musician and politico. And what I saw resonated with me, not only as a Nigerian American who had a father that's from Nigeria and grew up listening to Fela's music, but that music also influenced my own musical taste. I also wrote in this log that I would definitely be returning to the Studio Museum because of the experience that I had. And I can say that throughout my undergraduate career, I did return multiple times, and it was actually the Studio Museum that was my first museum membership once I graduated and got a full-time job. And unfortunately, I can't say that everyone has as great an experience as that. And I can contrast that with a trip that I took to the National Portrait Museum or Gallery later that year. And they are not short on depictions of those of European descent in that museum. And it was a completely different experience from what I had seen in the Studio Museum. And the reason why we probably see this lack of diversity in what we're seeing in cultural institutions goes back to this chart, where we're not seeing minorities represented in the influential creative and leadership positions that are at cultural institutions. Privilege is rewarded in a sector that has a history of unpaid internships that squeeze out economically disadvantaged groups, and where talent is typically sourced from private institutions and Ivy League institutions. In the survey that DCLA, or the Department of Cultural Affairs, did, one of the representatives of a cultural institution mentioned that 1 in 3 of their hires were former interns. And while I can't say this is the same statistic across the board for all organizations, we generally know that those that have experience and that have connections end up with jobs. At CUNY, the demographics look a lot different than what we're used to seeing at cultural institutions. For the class, or the fall 2016 enrollment, we have over 79% of individuals that are minorities, and this is also including those who are international students. 42% come from households with incomes less than $20,000. And 45% are first-generation college students. Unpaid internships are simply not an option for everyone. With the CUNY Cultural Corps, we recruit, we train, and develop interns to work in paid internships at cultural institutions. They are not just working in operations or facilities. They're working with curators. They're working with executive leadership and getting that integral experience that could lead to them one day having those very positions. We also provide professional development training to students and alumni on how to navigate the workplace. And we also provide cultural enrichment activities like visits to museums and interactions with cultural sector professionals. And to work to increase the inclusivity in these museum environments, we also train partners. We talk about issues of privilege and identity and cultural bias and emotional intelligence, again in the hopes of creating an environment where our interns feel welcome. So why now? What is the buzz about diversity inclusion? Well, society is in a pivotal moment with social justice issues that are mostly centered around racial, gender, and LGBTQIA equality issues and the intersections of those identities. And there have been plenty of dialogues and continuous dialogues about this diversity and inclusion issues, not just in cultural institutions, but in tech, in media, and in entertainment. And what we're seeing is that people want to be included in the conversation. And some of the conversations that you may have heard about, Black Lives Matter, Oscars So White, Time's Up, but then there are the lesser known diversity and inclusion issues, such as F Your Beauty Standards, which was started as a body positivity movement by a plus-size model named Tess Holliday. Whitewashed Out, which came after Oscars So White, when the roles that were typically Asian in comic books were recast in live-action movies as white. And recently, Grammy So Male, when of the top 8 categories, only one of them went to a woman. Really, what's going on here is, at the end of the day, people want to be included in the fabric of society in which they inhabit. And in these tumultuous times, it's very important that people feel represented in culture, whether it's media, whether it's music, whether it's art, to increase dialogues and move us to a situation where we are recognizing the commonalities that we share. Divisiveness is exacerbated by lack of representation or exposure to other people, cultures, and thoughts. And so in order to get to a point in society where we feel that we can have honest dialogues, we're going to need to rely on people being included in the culture that is being produced. So how do we move forward? What's next? While I'm not naive to believe that one article, one piece of art, a song is going to radically change the perspectives of a whole swath of people, we do know that exposure will at least get the conversation started and maybe one day change perceptions. But to bring this back to cultural institutions, there are 3 things that we can do. We can integrate, educate, and participate. By integrate, I mean that in order for us to address the needs of a rapidly changing population, all cultural institution departments, it's gotta be all hands on deck. It's not just up to human resources and leadership and curatorial and programming staff to address these issues. We're going to need the technology departments and the operations departments that help make institutions accessible, or finance and development that control the purse strings of these organizations and make things like hiring diverse individuals and producing diverse content possible. And also, interns are going to need to be involved in these conversations. Departments can involve their interns in discussions about how their institutions can be more inclusive. From K through 12 all the way through higher education, we're also going to need educators that are not in disciplines that are considered the arts to integrate the humanities into what they're doing. And we've seen that happen, and an example that I can share is of the City College of New York Engineering Department working in partnership with the Dance Theater of Harlem to create technology that will help improve dancers' performance. And if you are an educator that is in the humanities, making sure that your content is culturally relevant. And last, what we as average individuals can do is really participate. get involved in the policy discussions and planning discussions that are taking place, as well as contribute your time or contribute your money to let these institutions know that they are valued and have your support. And then the other thing that we can do is we can produce content ourselves and encourage those that are typically from communities where maybe the arts aren't encouraged to actually get involved. So as children who are interested in the arts, we should take risk. For those who are guardians, we should encourage that type of risk-taking. And as educators and advisors, we should provide the tools so that people can produce the cultural content that they want to see. Thank you.